And so this presence of China as a diplomatic, economic presence, as a presence in terms of construction, engineering, all have been deeply interesting to me. But also China has been able to find markets in Africa for its cheap consumer products. I often wonder, as someone concerned with Southern Africa, to the extent to which even South Africa's hegemony in many parts of Africa might even be challenged by cheaper Chinese products, by the increasing involvement. And I look at this from another perspective. China's current involvement has been controversial. There are negatives, of course. Is China a sort of neo-imperial power? Is it abusing Africa for its own natural resource needs? China's lack of concern with environmental and human rights. On the positive level, China's sort of freeing of Africa from Western hegemony is another question that we need to take into account. I have noted, however, that there is a much more reflective response to China in the media in Africa on the impact of China. I have seen a more critical level. And then, of course, I want to raise the point of where we are today. The moment of trauma daily as to where the Dow is. Where are we financially? What about China? What about its internal stimulus? What about its need for the products, resources, energy from Africa? Is this going to be transformed? Is this going to change because of these conditions? These are just a few personal reflections as I open this very exciting and interesting session. Over the next day and a half, an array of specialists will address these and other issues, and I really look forward to attending these sessions. And at the same time, I want to finally congratulate again Heidi, Maria, Samuel, for bringing together in this remarkable co-relationship, which is what we ought to be doing more of, in planning this excellent event. Thank you.
The good thing is that when you have people who are very knowledgeable speak first, then if you come, to the podium, you have to say nothing, speak, as we say in Ghana, speak less. All right. Now, today is Ghana's 52nd independence anniversary. Now, 52 years ago, Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, stood on a political platform and declared Ghana to be free, and Africa to be free for that matter. And to quote him verbatim, he said that Ghana is free, free forever, free at last. Then he also said that Ghana's independence was meaningless unless it was linked up with the total liberation of the African continent. So as Ghana celebrates her 52nd independence anniversary, we wanted to ask several questions. Is Ghana free? And as a linguist, I ask myself, what is the meaning of freedom? And that comes with the notion, what is the meaning of meaning? So we'll continue to debate, what independence means for Ghana and for Africa. We'll continue to ask questions such as, does political independence go hand in hand with economic independence? Why are we asking the question, for example, why is China in Africa? And of course, we can also ask, why was Europe in Africa? Is Africa a passive political actor in all these situations that we have? Or has Africa become a theater of chaos in which Africans and non-Africans insert themselves, cause confusion? Some cause more confusion than others. What is it that is going on? These are practical questions that we continue to ask ourselves as Africans and also as Africanists. And what I always tell myself is I wear a couple of hats. I'm an African, I'm from Ghana. Quite a number of Africans who come to the US. I've also taken on a US citizenship, so I'm an American, and I'm an Africanist. So these are questions which come to me all the time. Now, there can't be a better platform than what we have now. In our present political and economic dispensation, there can never be a better platform to have diplomats, business people, intellectuals, and the other categories of people that I will call those who ask questions, to assemble in this small room and to ask and try to answer those questions. Now, I want to first and foremost thank Maria. My name was mentioned as having contributed to organizing this, but I know, and anybody who works in the African Studies program knows, that there is someone who doesn't go home until after 8 o'clock. And that's Maria. I want to personally thank you, Maria, for working so hard to get this going. At some point, she took over literally from me. I was contacting people, and she, what can I say? Thank you. I also want to thank those of you who, agreed to, come to speak with us and to talk with us. One of the best gifts that a human being can have is a gift of listening. So we're going to listen with the ears of a rabbit. Now, lastly, let me kind of end by quoting a proverb. I can never speak without proverbs. A proverb that my father used to say. My father used to say that the traveler or the explorer educates his or her parents. You have traveled to Africa. You have traveled to China. You have a lot that we don't know. Now tell us so that we may know. Thank you very much to all of you for coming.
Well, as the third speaker to welcome you, I will say the least. And first of all, I'm delighted to see all of you here on this Friday morning. And I want to share with you just one quick story about last night, and then I will turn the floor over to our guest speakers. We were at Finch's last night, and I was with an economist, a historian, and an anthropologist. Speakers, Harry Broadman was the economist, of course. Jamie Monson was the historian, and Anita Spring, who you'll be hearing from later today, is the anthropologist. And it was a very multidisciplinary discussion about China and Africa, and I think that's the richness of what you'll be hearing today and tomorrow morning. So I encourage you to stay as long as you can for our sessions, and tomorrow morning is going to be a reflection on what we've learned and where we might go with that information. So I'm very excited about all of these presentations. I want to thank one more person, and that's Katie Bennett, who's standing in the back with the teal-colored sweater on. She is the Assistant Outreach Coordinator at the East Asian Studies Center and has done a lot of the legwork to pull this together, so thank you very much, Katie. One more point that I would like to make, and that is that, especially since last night, I've been thinking about, as the director of the East Asian Studies Center, I've been thinking about how we might continue this endeavor into the future, maybe even write it in our application to the Department of Education, our Title VI proposal will be due sometime this year. And I'm beginning to think of a follow-up on Africa and China. We talked a lot about transmigration last night, and that's a theme that I've become very interested in, so I'm going to think about that. And if you have any thoughts about Africa and China, all of you, please let me know throughout the day. I'm going to start taking notes. With that, I want to welcome you all again, thank our participants for coming from all over the world and showing up until 1 o'clock in the morning, but still being here at 8:30. So we have a very persistent, diligent, and engaged group. And Barb Flynn is the Director of Cyber. I want to thank Cyber for their generous financial support for this conference as well. And Barb, I hand the floor over to you. Thanks a lot.
Well, hello and welcome. You may be wondering what Cyber is. It has nothing to do with computers. It's the Center for International Business, Education, and Research. And we are also a Title VI center. And when you think about it, the reason, I suspect at least the primary reason that China is in Africa is business. So this is the interface that brings China and Africa together. I'm very excited about this and very intrigued to hear some of the presentations. Clearly, the presence of China in Africa is expanding dramatically with both positive and negative implications, and I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot about both sides of this as we move through the day. Now, the purpose of this day and a half is to be a symposium and to involve active discussion on the part of the audience. So what we're going to be doing for this first session, I'm going to ask each of the presenters to, start us off with about a 20-minute presentation. And then when they're done, we'll have a substantial amount of time for discussion from the audience. So please be thinking about, issues that you'd like to bring up and questions. And then we'll have about an hour for discussion when they're completed. So let me start out by welcoming the first speaker, Howard French from Columbia University School of Journalism, who's going to be talking about some of the consequences in Africa for what's going on in China. So, welcome.
I don't know, is this automatic?
Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start out by sort of walking back a bit in history and talking about my own encounter with Africa as a way of sort of setting the context for, hopefully, usefully for some of the, not just my own discussion, but for some of the subsequent discussions, and thinking about, by looking backwards, where we have come from, where Africa may be going, in particular its relationship with China. I first went to Africa. My first experience of Africa was in 1975. I visited Africa as a student, and when I finished college, I ended up moving to Africa and ended up ultimately living in the continent in various guises for about a decade. In 1975 was a period that I think of as sort of the height of France's post-colonial empire in Africa. Across the continent, certainly in all of the Francophone-speaking countries, France controlled everything that they thought was worth controlling. France, it's hard to convey this if you didn't actually see it, to get a real feel for the extent of France's sort of dominion over these places. French people went and recreated their own lifestyles, which went from nude beaches in Dakar and Abidjan to, cafe lifestyle, and the French Cultural Center, believe it or not, was the dominant cultural institution in most of these West African capitals at the time. I recall one of my early experiences back then as a freelance journalist, being invited to a cocktail party at the French embassy, and being on my way from Abidjan. I had a trip planned that week. I lived in Abidjan, and I was headed, I believe, to Burkina Faso, which was still then Upper Volta. The French ambassador, who I did not know previously, I may have encountered briefly somehow, but didn't really know him, exchanged pleasantries with me and said to me, apropos of nothing, so, Mr. French, what are you planning to do in Burkina Faso? Which meant that the French ambassador's intelligence apparatus had figured out that I was going to Burkina Faso and had made that, had taken interest in that fact. And the ambassador was not shy about, it certainly was not an accident that he was letting me know that he knew that I was going to Burkina Faso. The point here being that France had the region completely wired. The big political event on the calendar back then was, and for a very long time, was a ritualized meeting that became something of in fact this term was used in French, a grand mass in the Catholic Church sense of mass, where African heads of state were convened to go to France or somewhere else to meet with the French head of state. And you would have what was literally called a family photo, where the French president was figuratively the father, and you had all of his children gathered around, very happy to be seen in the same picture, jockeying for position. It was very important who could be closest in the picture to the French president, whether it was Houphouët-Boigny at one time, or Omar Bongo at other times, or whoever was up or down, who's going to be at the right-hand side of the father. This was a really big deal, and France enjoyed. These are just a few sort of little snippets to give you a sense of the enormous sway that France enjoyed on the continent at the time. I was talking with Harry Broadman before we began this morning about the World Bank's involvement with African development over the years and the ups and downs of this relationship, and we use the word inconsistencies. And one of the features of the inconsistency or inconsistencies of international financial institution engagement with African countries at the time was a political inconsistency. France was not alone in this, but I think France played this game particularly well, that if France wished to run interference for one of its favorite clients with the World Bank or with the International Monetary Fund, it found a way to do so, that it could swing the loan, help swing the loan for the country without the country having to subscribe to the full rigor of whatever the country, the bank or the fund's particular policy preferences of the moment might have been. As long as France was willing to sort of back the check, so to speak, France was able to pull that off. China back then, my first inklings of the Chinese presence back then, I was very curious as a student about China. My direct experience of China itself wouldn't come until, well, the first direct experience until the late 1980s. Ultimately, I ended up living in China for 5 years, just completed last August, and had lived in East Asia for about 10 years altogether. But my first sort of awareness of China in Africa came from travel, again as a freelance journalist in West Africa, beginning early in the 1980s, and seeing what struck me then, probably a bit naively, as a kind of colorful oddity. I would go to Niamey or to Ouagadougou or typically some Sahelian country, and the Sahelian countries, most of you will already know, tend to be in West and Central Africa, the poorest of the poor. And you would very often run into Chinese work crews, and these people were dressed in very sort of rustic Chinese clothing, and they were all working together in work teams, and you could, if you're out in the street early in the morning, you can see them very early in the morning going off to their work site, almost marching in disciplined file, and working very long days, with rudimentary tools, building something. Typically what they were building back then was a stadium. In some cases, it would have been a presidential palace or a House of Parliament, or some big public building that was making a statement of Chinese friendship with Africa. And very often the building would use the word friendship. The name of the building would involve the word friendship. This is our friendship stadium, or this is our friendship whatever. And I thought this was all kind of quaint and cute, and didn't really think much more of it. I mean, France's control of the continent seemed such that, of that part of the continent seemed such that this didn't seem like, certainly the French weren't worried about this. This didn't seem like it was the beginning of anything terribly major. It was more symbolic than anything else, or so it seemed. France's hold on Africa began a good bit later, in the mid-1990s, to unravel. And to unravel as I look back, thinking about how this happened, to unravel rather suddenly. I placed the sort of the beginning of this clear phase of unraveling at the Rwandan genocide, with France having made some very bad decisions politically about its involvement in the Rwandan crisis, having been very slow to understand properly the nature of this crisis, and having backed the wrong horse, so to speak. The reason France backed the horse that it backed, meaning the defeated Hutu government, is a very interesting one. France saw, or thought that it saw, a big plot led by the United States, either directly or indirectly, to take over its domain in Africa, and So France saw Rwanda and Burundi as being sort of a fault line. Beyond Rwanda and Burundi, going eastward, lie East Africa, lie Uganda and Tanzania and Kenya, which are, East African countries, which have a history, although a very mixed history, of trying to work together to form some kind of community. And so France has this vision that if Rwanda falls to a rebel force that's based in Uganda, then Rwanda will eventually will fall into the orbit of this nascent community of East African countries. And this will be the end of will be the beginning of a sort of domino process, whereby France loses its entire sort of stake in Africa. Interestingly enough, I mean, just to give you a sort of a sense of the depth of arrogance of all of this, Rwanda was never a French colony. It was a French-speaking country officially, but it was never a French colony. And the big prize in this French calculation, of course, was the country then known as Zaire, which was the third largest country in Africa, which was also never a French colony, but was a Belgian colony. I should back up very quickly to say at the high water mark of this sort of grand mass policy where France was convening African heads of state, English-speaking heads of state were also clamoring to become part of the family photo. At the high water mark of this experience, for a long time, English-speaking state, well, initially they weren't welcome. And then for a phase, most English-speaking state leaders wouldn't be caught dead in that sort of kind of celebration. But toward the end of it, just before the fall, so to speak, of this French period, a bunch of English-speaking states and Lusophone states were petitioning France to be part of this French condominium. So Rwanda falls apart. There's a genocide. The English-speaking invaders from Uganda win. The next thing that happens is Mobutu faces an insurrection, and he is overthrown. And that sort of marked the end for France. I mean, in the space of 2-3 years, this entire French world that France had worked very hard to build up over a very long period of time and had taken very seriously, investing not just lots of money and business interests, but tons and tons of political capital, was gone. France never really recovered from that. I think for me, the Zairean Congo experience was a real sort of dagger in the heart. The French political class lost the heart to compete in Africa and lost interest in Africa. One of the real ironies of this is that France was motivated to try to prop up Mobutu, and it was motivated to do what it did in Rwanda because it thought that the United States was waiting in the wings to take over Africa. And nothing could be further from the truth. The United States showed no interest in that period and has shown no interest since in enlarging its portfolio in Africa, in becoming, politically speaking, in becoming a bigger, more ambitious actor in Africa. And so you have the Americans who, after the disappearance of the Soviet Union, turned their attentions elsewhere. Africa, which was never the sort of A-grade theater for them to begin with, becomes a real sort of afterthought. And the French go home disheartened, having lost what they've worked all of this time to build and having invested so heavily in. What does that leave us with? That leaves us with the Chinese, who have been building very quietly, starting off at a very low grade, very patient, almost as I said back, from my earliest experiences, starting off with very small symbolic sorts of efforts to sort of build the idea of a Chinese-African friendship. Chinese essentially inherited a vacuum in Africa. And this vacuum occurs at the exact time when the Chinese economy is attaining a kind of momentum globally that gave the Chinese state the kind of wherewithal that you need to become a real intercontinental player. I think of the next big moment really as being the moment that signals the era that I think that this conference is going to be discussing quite a bit. The era, this era that's upon us of Chinese-African intense and growing engagement. I think of the sort of a real sort of critical moment in signaling the onset of this era. It was 2004, I believe. Harry will correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that the year was 2004 when Angola was in discussions with the International Monetary Fund about a package of budgetary support and other kinds of resources, lending, and these discussions went on for a very long time, and they were, dragging on, and Angola was really sort of in a cash crunch, and the Angolans on the one hand had tremendous resources, literally just underground, but didn't have any money in the bank, and the fund was saying, we want you to do the following things, and if I recall correctly, the nub of the issue here with the fund was, at least in terms of the public part of these discussions, was poverty alleviation. The International Monetary Fund was raising a variety of conditions about the nature of Angola's poverty alleviation efforts as a condition for providing the money that Angola sought. At that moment in 2004, China steps up and says to Angola, you need money, just tell us how much. Money's not a problem. And in a very short order, China has come to terms with Angola to provide a very, I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but a quite important package of lending that essentially makes the IMF discussion irrelevant and allows Angola to get over the hump financially in terms of its immediate crunch and to do a variety of other things. This turns into the beginning of a bigger relationship with Angola that has continued to expand and has taken on enormous dimensions in Angola itself, but also the beginning of the emergence of a new kind of model in terms of the way China has come to engage with Africa generally. And that model has in fact come to be called the Angola model, where China says to African countries that are cash-strapped, that don't care to go the old route with the IFIs, look, if you have a resource that we need in your, underground, in your soil, we can come to terms. We'll provide you the cash, you provide us controlling interest in the exploitation of whatever it is whatever that commodity is, and we'll figure out a formula whereby over a certain number of years we'll get our money back by controlling the trade and that extraction and trade of that commodity. This model has sort of, as it's been rolled out and elaborated, this model has come to involve a lot of other things beyond simply money. These include the building of railroads and ports and airports and universities and housing and new capitals and all sorts of other things. So that's the Angola model. And the latest wrinkle of this is the Angola model as applied to Congo, another, perhaps Africa's most resource-rich country, perhaps also Africa's most disorganized country, perhaps the country in Africa with the deepest and most troubling history of corruption and the lack of sort of solidity of state institutions and governance. China is in the midst of a discussion with Congo, very much like the Angola discussion that I've described to you, that also involves, as a sort of third leg to the stool, the IMF again. The IMF has said to the IMF, Congo is a heavily indebted country. It owes a lot of money based on past borrowings to international financial institutions and to others. And the IMF has raised a certain number of conditions about clearing its books or committing to, servicing this debt before new debt can be, before new lending can be provided. And this happens, that discussion happens at the very time that China has stepped forward with a package that's been reported to be worth variously, the most common figure, $9 billion, to do all sorts of things, to essentially rebuild the entire infrastructure of the copper mining zone in I'm going to have to go really quickly, in southern Africa. I'm the guinea pig for the 5 minutes. And it's not clear how this is going to turn out. Just last week, in the midst of the international financial collapse and amid the drastic fall in the price of commodities that has seen, I know Wen Zhang is going to talk about Katanga later in this conference and the pullout of Chinese entrepreneurs there. But even against that, in the midst of this crisis, the Chinese ambassador to Congo said, we are going ahead with our $9 billion package. We will not submit to the judgment of the IMF. We consider that blackmail of the Congo. We're going to proceed with this loan. I don't think it's fashionable to say what I'm going to say, and I want you to withhold judgment on the description I'm about to give you until I've fully explained myself. But I don't think it's too early to begin speaking or to begin thinking about what's happening with China and Africa as in the same sorts of terms as I was discussing the French era in Africa. I don't think that we are likely to see an exact duplication or replication of what France did in Africa, but I think that in terms of the scope of China's engagement with Africa, I think in terms of the scope of China's ambition in Africa, I think what we have in store is, if anything, an even bigger dominion than what France enjoyed, because of the size of the Chinese economy, because of the nature of Chinese industry, and because of the needs of Chinese industry. I think that we are likely to see over time the emergence of investment, of trade, of political ties, and a variety of other links between Africa and China that are every bit as thoroughgoing, if you will, as what we saw between France and Africa. In the interest of time, I'm going to be real short, and we can follow up in greater detail in the discussion period. But I asked myself a few questions. The first question is, when this subject comes up, as it comes up a lot, and with me it comes up a lot with Chinese people, are you trying to say that we're bad people? Are you trying to say that we're bad guys? Is what we're doing bad? And the corollary to that question is often, not always, but often, look at all the stuff that the Western people do. And I keep in mind Samuel's very pertinent comments earlier about, where does Africa stand in all of this? Unfortunately, I think Africa has too often been a vessel as opposed to an actor in a proactive sense in its own political and economic destiny. I don't think that Africa belongs to the West. I don't think that Africa should belong to China. I really, just in terms of my own personal feelings on this question, desperately hope for a more proactive Africa, a more proactive African approach to its own economic and political destinies. I don't think Africa is quite there yet. I think Africa is obviously a very big place with a lot of different actors, and some states show a lot more forward-looking ness than others. Some states show a lot more technocratic competence than others. Some states show more a keener sense for deal-making and for strategic planning than others, and all of those things are really needed if you want to be master of your own destiny. But the quick answer of, is this a bad thing? I mean, if I had to say yes or no, my answer would be no. And the reason, if I'm restricted to a yes or no answer, I say no, is because I believe I was asked in a group of talk with journalists last night whether there's any difference between U.S. foreign policy and Chinese foreign policy at the end of the day, the way the United States engages with countries around the world. Is it any different from the way China engages with other countries around the world? And my answer to that was that for all of American hypocrisy, for all of the bad that the United States has done historically in various places around the world, for all of, all of the things that we can accuse our foreign policy of, historically speaking, excuse me, my own view is that having an ethical component, if I'm given a choice between a foreign policy that has an ethical component, explicitly ethical component, and a foreign policy that does not have an explicitly ethical component, I would choose in favor of an explicitly ethical component, that ethics matter to me, and a moral dimension to a foreign policy, even an imperfect one, matters to me. The point of this comment is to come back to the yes or no. Is China's growing role in Africa a good or a bad thing? The yes or no answer is no. And the reason it's not a bad thing is because given a choice between Africa being continuingly marginalized and isolated in terms of the world economy, and an Africa that is being gradually globalized in good and bad ways by virtue of its engagement with Africa, I choose the latter. I think that there is a much greater potential upside from the latter than there is from the former. If I can go beyond the yes and no answer, my second and third answers are maybe it's a good thing or maybe it's a bad thing. And my third answer is yes, it could be a really bad thing. China is deceiving itself and or doing a grave disservice to Africa if it believes that governance is none of its business. And governance will necessarily involve messy things, like getting involved with African civil society in a proactive way, and democratic growth of African societies, without which we will end up with scenario 3. China's engagement with Africa is a bad thing. And scenario 3 consists of the following forecast. By the year 2050, Africa will have 2 billion people, according to the United Nations. If these people are confined to failed states with depleted, unrenewable resources and degraded environments, all of their copper, their cobalt, their bauxite, their oil, their timber, their uranium, etc., gone, and now the population is more than double of these countries, then and China has merely paid cash on the barrel and said, it's not really our problem if stuff went wrong, we just came to do business, then we will be in a very bad place. Africa will be in a very bad place. And I think it is deceiving ourselves to imagine that the consequences of that very bad place will be confined to Africa. 2 billion people in a collection of failed states will not be the problem of those collective failed states. It will be a problem of everyone. And so I think that there's a necessary urgency to thinking this through and to working with China, not to wagging our fingers in China's face, but working with China to figure out ways that we don't end up at that situation. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I like the way you ended that. I think this is a good theme for the entire symposium. Is China's expanding influence in Africa a good thing or a bad thing? Or something in between. And again, what's unique about this symposium is that it's looking at this issue from both the perspective of Africa and the perspective of China, which is very interesting. Howard has done a really nice job of laying the foundation for the discussions that are going to be continuing for the next day and a half. And I'd like to build on that by introducing our next speaker, Harry Broadman, who's going to be speaking from the perspective of an economist, former official of the World Bank, and also from the perspective of the U.S. government. So, are you
ready.
Set here? Okay.
I'm ready.
All right. Well, thank you.
First of all, I want to say very much appreciate the opportunity to speak here. I was waiting when were talking about dinner last night when you said that you were describing having dinner with an economist, an anthropologist, and a historian. I was afraid it was going to be a very bad joke. I was really relieved that it was actually a serious comment.
I have another one. What happens when they walk into a bar? But I'll save that for
I was delighted to hear Howard's presentation. I think it's a great overlay of the conference, and actually leads in very nicely to what I want to talk about as well. I want to begin, I think, playing off a bit what Howard had to say and make a few sort of overarching statements about the historical and political context about my presentation. First, and of course I'm speaking from an economic or political economic point of view. What trade and investment between China and Africa epitomizes is this relatively new trend of South-South trade and investment. That is trade and investment between developing countries. South-South trade and investment accounts for about 20-25% of global trade and investment, up from about 10% a decade ago. It's a growing share of global commerce. The second point I would want to make at the very outset is that, as Howard also said, but I think for most observers, if you get your information about Chinese involvement in Africa simply from newspapers, is that China has been involved in Africa for decades. Again, when I speak in Africa or I speak in Europe or the United States, many people think that China only recently discovered Africa. And it's quite startling, I think, when you present the facts that, in fact, the Chinese have been involved on the continent for quite a long time. In fact, so long, as Howard has indicated, and for those of us who know about the Chinese involvement in Africa, that it's been quite an evolution of their involvement in Africa, which we can speak about in a moment. The third point that I would make, and I think this is really important when we think about this entire issue, is that China is a developing country. I think, particularly for those of us in the West, in advanced countries, who are mesmerized by the fact that virtually everything that we buy, consumer goods and even many of our durable goods, are made in China, we think of China as Beijing or Shanghai, or the East Coast generally, or the southern parts of China, where many people are quite well off. Well, the vast majority of the Chinese live in the interior of the country, which is quite poor. Not terribly dissimilar from many African people. And I think when one thinks about this debate about whether Chinese involvement in Africa is good or bad, one has to recognize that some of the issues that the Chinese authorities are dealing with has to do with the fact that this is a developing country. And they're dealing with reputational risk, all kinds of issues that developing countries have to wrestle with that are arguably qualitatively different than advanced countries who have been on the world stage for many, many decades. And I just think it's very important to think about this fact and not believe, as, again, if you took a poll, I think, on the street, is China a developing country or a developed country, most people would probably say, oh no, it's a member of the OECD. The fourth point I wanted to point out, and Howard ended on this point, I was glad that he did, because I think many people forget that Africa's a continent, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, which is the focus of my remarks. It's a subcontinent of 47, according to the World Bank lexicon, 47 different countries, incredibly heterogeneous. We speak of Africa, indeed the title of this symposium, virtually every symposium on this topic, is China in Africa, as if Africa is a unit. Well, it's not a unit. I mean, it's a continent, but it's, analytically, it's not a terribly interesting or meaningful unit. These are countries, and the Chinese realize that there are different countries in which they make investments, and I think it's incredibly important to recognize that. And so, yeah, Africa is a shorthand that we will be referring to throughout this day and a half, and I do so to some extent in this presentation, but I think it's really important that we understand that there's a distinction between a continent and a unit that's comprised of 47 different countries. On the other side of the ledger, of course, China is a country, but it's, of course, a very heterogeneous country, very, very large. But I think it's really important, and I think many people lose sight of these kinds of distinctions. What I want to talk to you about today draws from a book that I wrote about a year and a half ago before I left the bank, that is an empirical piece drawing on data on the operations of Chinese and Indian firms actually operating on the ground in Africa. And so this is, as far as I know today, still the only study that really looks statistically and building on business case studies on the operations of Chinese and Indian firms. First point I want to make is, how do the Chinese view the African continent? It surprises, I think, many people who are not familiar with Africa. And these slides obviously predate the last 4 to 6 months. But the point still stands, looking at the broad sweep of time, is that most people, I think, who are not familiar with African economic development believe, apart from South Africa, that Africa is a continent that is in the doldrums. And the fact of the matter is that A, it's a heterogeneous continent, as I've explained before, but more importantly, there is a very large number of countries that have been growing extremely well for a very long period of time. And I'm not talking about the blue block of countries, which are the resource-rich countries. I'm talking about the 17 countries in the middle. These are not the resource-rich countries. These are countries who clearly have been growing as a result of deft economic policy. We're not seeing boom and bust cycles over a very long period of time. This is a striking picture for most people who don't understand what has been happening in Africa. And I dare say that Chinese, the Indians, the Russians, the Middle Eastern investors have recognized this heterogeneity, have recognized that there are in fact bona fide economic success stories on the continent, whereas the US investors, traditional European investors, have not recognized this. They now are, in part because of what the Chinese and the Indians and others are doing. How do the Africans view China? Well, clearly they are viewing China as opportunities for places to sell exports. In the first instance, of course, these are natural resource-based exports. What's I think striking is that the growth rate of exports to Asia have really been surpassing the shares of growth rates to Europe and the United States. But notice I'm accenting growth rates. And the reason I'm accenting growth rates as opposed to levels is because if you take a slice today of the stock of foreign direct investment in sub-Saharan Africa, more than 90% of foreign direct investment in Africa today is still dominated by the United States and European Union. What what China and India represent is still the tail of the dog. People are very excited, arguably so, perhaps, because they're looking at the flow rates of what the Chinese are doing in Africa. But they're losing sight of the fact that the cumulative stock of foreign direct investment in Africa is still dominated by the traditional investors for the moment. And I think it's really important that we not lose sight of the statistics. When I go to Africa, and I've spoken about this book for a year and a half, I mean, it was a very emotionally laden discussion. Many, many Africans particularly in universities, saying, we need to learn to speak Chinese because we're going to have to speak it in the next 5 years. And I just think that's a very, very strong metaphor and an overstatement of what is happening. And so it's very important, you would not be surprised to hear this from an economist, to be distinguishing between flow rates and levels. That doesn't mean to say that the flow rates are not spectacular, they are. But I think it's really important to make these kinds of distinctions. Now, the question before us, and I think Howard has laid it out just as well as I am, is does this represent a second opportunity? This first opportunity in my mind was the traditional North-South trade and investment. At present, as I just alluded to, most of the trade and investment between China and Africa is natural resource based. And so it represents the traditional North-South investment. But this is beginning to change. It's beginning to change in the last 3 to 5 years. It's not just only oil. There's a significant amount of investment by China in Africa in food processing, telecoms, light manufacturing, furniture, construction, back office services, ICT, financial services. The rates of growth in these other non-oil sectors is much more rapid than in the oil sector. Again, the oil sector in the statistics are dominant. And why is that the case? It's dominant because investments in oil are lumpy investments. The fixed costs are huge. You're either in or you're out. And capital-intensive investments like oil are extremely large. So when you have a project in Sierra Leone or Angola, statistically the numbers blow up. But when you look at the number of projects that you're making in telecom or construction or food processing, and you do the arithmetic that way, and you look at what Chinese are doing across Africa, you'll see the diversification across sectors is rapidly increasing in these sectors. And as a development economist, to me, to some extent, that's far more important than what is happening numerically just in the oil sector. That's not to discount that what's happening in the oil sector is important, but I think you can't just look at simply the value of a particular sector without looking also at the distribution across sectors. Well, can this, quote, second opportunity be realized? I mean, my view, coming from this research on this book, is that by no means is it a guarantee. And the outcome will depend on proactive actions. I'm glad that Howard used the same adjective that I've been using as well. And it's proactive actions on the part, largely, in the first instance, on the African states, which in turn, I will argue, depends on African civil society to demand that their states take certain actions. Also proactivity on the part of Chinese policymakers and business. Let me give you some examples of kinds of proactive reforms that need to be taken. And these draw from the book. What I did in the book was I looked at, and I'm obviously giving you an extremely high-level summary of the analysis, is I tested various hypotheses of the importance of sort of orthodox trade policy versus non-orthodox behind-the-border policies that might explain why certain countries in Africa are attracting investment by China and India, and why others are not attracting trade and investment by China and India. So I wanted to compare trade policy, the importance of trade policy, which is sort of the orthodox view of the bank and the fund, versus behind-the-border domestic reforms, which trade policy economists, of which I'm one, often don't think of as part of, sort of in the arsenal of policy reforms for international integration. Two policies in the trade area were very clearly leaping out from the data as sources of reform. The first is in the area of what Africans need to do on their trade policy front. Most African countries, not all, but most African countries are members of the WTO. If you look at their average tariff rates, they're relatively low, by dint of the fact that they're members of the WTO. Tariff rates are not a big issue for further reform in Africa. What is a big issue is the fact that there are non-tariff barriers, quotas and the like. But more importantly is the fact that Africa as a continent, and here's where we get to the issue of the individual countries, is a continent cursed by geographic fragmentation, small country size. And the only way out to get economies of scale is to create synthetically large markets. And one does that in any region of the world through trade agreements. Free trade agreements, either bilaterally or regionally. So what Africa has done, just as the former Soviet Union countries have done, Latin America has done, East Asia has done, has created a series of free trade agreements. So this picture shows you the series of regional trade agreements that are in place in Africa. The problem in Africa, and this is not unique to Africa, is that these are overlapping trade agreements. And this is not, in fact, fostering regional integration in Africa. And there's a very clear reason, in my view, why this is taking place in Africa. And again, it's one of the reasons why it's taking place in other regions in the world as well. And that is that the policymakers would much prefer to try to cure the problems of regional integration and trade barriers at a very high level, rather than deal with the individual national level barriers to trade. Why is that? Because dealing at the national level barriers to trade involve dealing with vested interests in the home countries. It's much easier to get on a plane, fly between the capitals and say, let's see if we can negotiate inter-country trade agreements and see if that will foster trade between our countries. The problem is that that is not going to work if the national level barriers and infrastructure are not cleaned up first. And when we talk to the businesses, whether they're Chinese, Indian, European, US, or African, these trade agreements, in fact, not only do not foster trade among African countries, they in fact get in the way of trade, because there are very complicated rules of origin that companies try to game to try to take advantage of these trade agreements. So one of the policy recommendations is to harmonize these trade agreements. Imagine in Africa where there was one free trade area or two or three free trade areas. And this has been one of the things I used to work on in the Balkans. I can draw you the same kind of spaghetti bowl in the Balkans where there are 28 free trade agreements overlapping among 8 countries. So I say it's not unique to Africa. But it's a metaphor for a policy mistake for a really legitimate goal of regional integration. So that's what Africans need to do as a priority in trade policy reform at home. On the trade policy front, on what the Chinese need to do, Chinese have been very good about putting in place trade policy reforms, again, as part of the WTO membership, in terms of level of tariffs. But then when you look deeper at what economists call escalating tariffs, there's a very pernicious problem in the structure of tariff rates as you process goods more and more up the value chain. So when you look at cocoa, or you look at other goods that are on this table, you find that it doesn't pay to try to export in to China from Africa certain commodities higher up the value chain because it's prohibitively expensive to do so. It's not profitable to export into China certain commodities higher up the value chain. This is, again, one of the real curses that Africa faces today. Most of its commodities are in the raw material form. Part of the problem is that the export markets in which these commodities are trying to be exported to have protectionist policies in place, namely in the form of escalating tariffs. One does not discover this until one digs deeply into these tariff schedules to find this out. This occurs not just in China, it occurs in India and the like. Part of this picture, part of this problem is a more generic problem that, again, most people don't focus on as part of the Doha round, is that it's not just the North that is protectionist against Africa. In fact, one could argue that the real problem for Africa is Southern protection. It's the Brazils, it's the Indians, it's the Chinese. So those are 2 points on trade policy. But my argument is that even if these tariffs were cured, even if these trade policy agreements in Africa were cured, there are very serious problems that Africa needs to take care of in order to be proactive in dealing with the Chinese. What are some examples? One example is the fact that looking at the structural competitiveness of domestic markets in Africa, one sees pretty clearly, and this is just a sample of the countries that we looked at in this book, is that most markets in Africa are not structurally competitive. That is, they are oligopolistically structured. Now, all of the things equal, when you get foreign investment into a market, depending on the form that that foreign investment takes, if it's bona fide greenfield entry, as opposed to taking over an incumbent firm, which is more likely the case of what China and India and other firms are doing, you're going to be stirring up competition by the fact that you're having a new entrant. This is all to the good in the case of Africa, if that's the form of entry. Okay? This is a huge problem for Africa because the typical market is not competitive. Another behind-the-border problem in Africa is not on the product market, which we were just talking about, but what economists call the factor market, labor and capital. Within African markets, it is very difficult to hire or fire workers who are inefficient. So you don't have mobility across countries or within a country for workers to get higher paying jobs if in fact they're more productive, or companies are not free to fire workers who are not productive, and so you don't have this turnover of assets, whether it's capital or whether it's workers. This is the problem of government policy, in part. Again, these are all domestic policies. These are policies that are in the government's hands. Third problem behind the border is weak institutions. And here I just picked out one, which is not surprising for those of us who know Africa, are the problems of getting goods to ports. And this is compounded, obviously, by the fact that we have a continent comprised of geographically fragmented countries who are landlocked. You can see how in sub-Saharan Africa the time needed to get your goods out of the factory gate to the port is extremely long compared to East Asia or South Asia. Now, for the Chinese, what the Chinese and Indians and others are doing in terms of making investments in infrastructure, in my mind, this is a profitable opportunity to build these kinds of infrastructures to plug this gap. Now as an investment advisor and an investor in Africa, to me, I see this as an opportunity, particularly in a region where you have cross-border problems getting goods to the port. Let me focus a little bit on some of the dimensions of China's corporate strategy in Africa. It's very clear from these data that where are the workers from the surveyed firms that I looked at in this book, where are the workers from Chinese firms coming from? So if you look at the left-hand column under domestic, 81% of the workers in Chinese firms in this sample of firms in Africa are coming from China. You also see that in the case of India, sorry, are hired locally in Africa. If you look on the right-hand column under China, 10% of those 9.5% are coming from China in the Chinese firms. By the same token, India is also sourcing a lot of their workers also from India. The point is that a lot of criticism has been leveled against Chinese firms for sourcing a lot of their workers from China. The fact is that the world is gray. In various sectors, it's quite true that China will source a lot of their workers through internal channels. In other sectors, they will not. They will take advantage of local labor markets. But you'll see that also India does the same thing. Other nationality firms will do the same thing. This is, in my view, this is a clinical response to market conditions. It's a response to risk strategies. And I think it's really important to not make blanket statements until one looks at the data as to how firms are operating. And you'll see more of this when you look at vertical integration on the product side, not on the worker side. This looks at where are the Chinese versus other nationality firms sourcing their inputs. So 55% of the inputs of the Chinese firms working in Africa are sourcing their inputs from China. These are internally sourced inputs. Whereas the Indians are only sourcing 26% of their inputs from India. Now, going back to Howard's question, is this good or bad? Well, as an economist, in the first instance, this could be interpreted as a classic response to risk. The Chinese, who have not been in Africa as long as the Indians, who see Africa as a much more riskier environment than do the Indians, this is sort of economics 101, that in the question of vertical integration of sourcing your inputs, when you face a risky environment, you're not going to buy on the local market, you're going to source internally. This is a very robust finding when you look at the survey data time and time again. It's smacking you in the face from the data. It's a very robust finding. Similarly, when you look at the horizontal integration across markets in Africa, you find a really interesting finding. By dint of the fact that Chinese firms, and Indian firms for that matter, have integrated corporate structures, what they are bringing to Africa are their corporate entities off the shelf. And they are engaged in regional integration by dint of their corporate strategies on the African continent. Remember the discussion about why regional integration is so important in Africa, because of the geographic fragmentation, the small market size, and the like. Well, it turns out that when you look at these data, the Chinese firms in this survey are engaging in more pan-African integration. That is to say, they have multiple plants across countries in Africa than do the African firms. It's not a criticism of the African firms, but it's showing you that by dint of the fact that these Chinese firms tend to be the best and the most modern Chinese firms, these are the firms, of course, that are going abroad from China, are engaging in multi-plant operations in Africa. This is all to the good, in a clinical sense, for African regional integration. Again, you only would understand this if you do this empirical work looking at the micro level of firm operations on the ground. The final slide before I conclude is, I think, another really important finding looking at these micro data of the operations of firms. Again, remember, the real problem in Africa from an economic development point of view is the vast majority of the exports are in the form of raw materials. Again, by dint of the fact that the Chinese firms, the vast majority of the Chinese firms coming to Africa are the large multinationals. They are, in their exports from their African plants, exporting higher up the value chain off the continent than are the African firms exporting from their own continent. So if you look at the orange column, the last row, the bottom row, 13% of the African firms surveyed, 13% of their exports are still in the form of raw materials. But if you go across the Chinese firms, none of their exports coming out of their Chinese plants on African soil are in the form of raw materials. 25% are partially finished and 75% are finished assembled. In other words, they're processing more, they're extracting value on the African continent prior to their being exported. So they're actually climbing the value chain on the African continent prior to being exported. So this is helping, on the margin, dealing with this value chain problem that African firms have not been able to solve. Some closing thoughts. The point is, I believe that this sort of, quote, newfound interest that China is having in Africa could present a significant opportunity for growth and international integration for Africa, but I emphasize could. The data that are presented in the book, in which I've just given you a summary of, indicates or suggests that many of the Chinese firms that are operating on the continent are fostering global, for the first time I would argue, fostering global and interregional integration on Africa, export diversification, and indeed value creation on the continent. But there are major asymmetries between what China is bringing to Africa and what Africa is bringing to Africa. One should have their eyes wide open about this. But things are changing rapidly. And the outcome does depend on proactivity. My view, and I think the DRC deal is a metaphor for that. There are lots of warts in the DRC deal. The Angola situation, I think, also is a metaphor. That there are lots of problems with Angola's most recent agreement with China. The Africans have, in my view, unexploited bargaining power vis-a-vis the Chinese. And this comes back to my original point in the first slide, that this is South-South commerce. And I think there's a qualitatively different character in South-South commerce than there is between North and South commerce. And that's why I have some degree of hope that this is an opportunity for the Africans to exploit, but it really is a question of being proactive. And it's not so much, as my last bullet suggests, it's not so much a question of trade policy. Yes, there are trade policy reforms that need to take place. But by and large, the reforms that need to take place, where the proactivity needs to take place, is domestically. And so then the question is, who needs to take these reforms? And it's got to be the governments. And then we get into a very complicated discussion, but it's really where the rubber meets the road, is what role does civil society need to take? How can they take action if there's oppression, if there's not political freedom? But it seems to me that the ball very much is in the African court. And I think one needs to be realistic and, at least in the first instance, have a clinical view about what China is doing in Africa before one draws conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting to reflect on some of the things that, excuse me, that Harry was speaking about. I guess we tend to think of direct foreign investment in Africa as being based primarily on resources and probably resource exploitation. But as China's economy continues to grow by leaps and bounds, even in the challenging world economy, and costs get much more expensive in China, even though we look at China as a low-cost source for outsourcing, costs are getting higher and higher in China, and China's turning to Africa, and makes us think about whether in the future Africa may be able to experience similar rapid development, similar to what's been going on in China. So for our third presentation, we turn to Patrick Keenan from the University of Illinois, who's going to present the legal perspective, in particular looking at human rights and the social implications of China and Africa.
Thanks a lot, and thanks to Howard and Harry for really interesting talks. My concern, the focus of what I'm going to talk about today, are the ground level effects of Chinese investments in Africa and the effects on ordinary people. And I think that we've seen the data that Harry has shown, and I should say his book I think is a terrific book, and it's it's the best one of its kind and the best one in recent years, I think, of not just about China and Africa, but about any sort of bilateral or kind of multilateral arrangement like that. So I really commend it to you, and I think you can buy it as a PDF too. So
No, you have to buy it. You have to buy it.
So I commend the book to you. But the one thing, I want to kind of reframe our discussion and think about Chinese investment in Africa in a different way. This is not the first time we've seen a lot of big influx of money in Africa. And the cautions that Howard and Harry have given us that this is not China's first, in the last 10 years, is not the first time China's been in Africa. That's all true, but the scope and the scale of Chinese investment has taken off immensely. So even though the history is important, I think the current era is different in magnitude. But this is not the first time there's been an enormous influx of wealth in Africa, and I think we can learn from that. And I think there's more to learn from that than from looking back at previous iterations of Chinese engagement in Africa. And so the idea that big influxes of wealth will be helpful to ordinary people in Africa is one that I think the evidence shows hasn't really panned out that well. And in my talk today, I'll talk about 2 or 3 different dimensions or domains of wealth. One is natural resource wealth, so the sale of natural resources. This is just money coming into African countries. The other is development assistance, so foreign aid. And I think that this is Chinese investment. We are now in, I don't know, depending on how you want to time it, and at least coming to the end of the first decade of this intense focus and the enormous transfers of wealth. So we're getting some data, but not the quality of data that we have for resource wealth and development assistance. And I think this is likely to continue. It's likely to continue because China's going to keep investing. Also because just a couple weeks ago, the World Bank, the IFC, announced that it's starting a new strategic funds initiative to channel investments from sovereign wealth funds into Africa. And the idea is that if sovereign wealth funds invest in the neighborhood of 1% of their assets under management, it would be about a $30 billion influx of wealth funneled through, in some structure or another, through the IFC into equity stakes in African firms. And so I think that this idea that there's going to be a lot of money flowing is important. Based on earlier examples, I think that my answer to the question that Howard posed would be, this is likely not to be a good thing for Africa. And it's a strange sort of anomaly. And I should mention a couple of caveats. First, when any of us who've done work in Africa, when we think about investments or development assistance, you can always think of successes. And so I'm not saying that there's never been successes. And in what I'll talk about in the next few minutes, I'm not suggesting that there have been no examples of successful investments. There have been plenty of them. But in the aggregate, the evidence, I think, should make us very skeptical about whether this is likely to, this era of investment is likely to be beneficial to Africans. So what I want to do is to look back and draw lessons for the world we find ourselves in now. So the summary is the resource curse. Resource-dependent countries are, on average, worse off than countries that are not dependent on resources, subject to a couple of conditions. Now the data the interesting stuff nowadays is about development assistance, and there's I think pretty good evidence that that's not as effective as it should have been, given the magnitude of the wealth that's been transferred. The impact on the lives of the people who were the nominal beneficiaries just hasn't appeared, and it's, as I said, it's anomalous because it's sort of like reading about people who won the lottery, and when you read stories about, I saw an academic article interviewing people who had won the lottery, and many of them said that their lives are worse after they won the lottery. That they got a lot of money, their behavior changed, those behavioral changes led to a worsening quality of their life. And that is a simple and perhaps simple-minded kind of analogy to draw, but I think in some ways it tells the story of previous influxes of wealth to Africa. So the questions that are most important, one is, why does this happen? What do we know about why this happens? And then what does this mean for Chinese investment? And so a couple of things that we know about why it happens. One is there are four, I think, principal mechanisms by which influxes of wealth can have negative impacts in developing countries. The first is what's often called the Dutch disease, and this is the kind of the economic distortions that are worked by having one sector of the economy dominate and attract all the capital and all the labor, and other sectors of the economy kind of start to wither, and the net effect is that the economy as a whole does less well than it would have done had the resource sector or the capital-intensive sector not done that. I think that's important, but I think that it explains relatively little of the lack of success of countries that are dependent on resource wealth and that have been dependent on development assistance. Three other kinds of distortions that I'll talk about. One is behavioral distortions, and this is the ways that when there's a sector that's absorbing all the capital and all the labor, entrepreneurial people who want to start businesses, who want to think about how they can best better themselves and their families, they'll be drawn to that sector. And there's an opportunity cost here, that instead of the generation of a broad multi-sector economy, then people are all working in the same sector, and it attracts all the smartest people. And so if there's the analogy that I've seen in writings by other people is that it draws the smartest people to figure out how to get a bigger slice of the existing pie instead of people growing the pie, to use Bill Clinton's term. And so in resource-dependent economies, and in economies where aid, foreign development assistance is a big part of the budget, it kind of draws the best people, it draws the most entrepreneurial people, and the other sectors of the economy don't work as well. There's not the same level of innovation, there's not the same level of development of new ideas, that people are reluctant to take risks in these other sectors because there's a much surer payoff in the resource sector or the kind of aid or government sector. So the two distortions I mentioned, one, economic distortions, I think explains a relatively small part. These behavioral distortions, I think it's hard to measure, but nonetheless, the data suggests that it is an important component, that when there's one sector that draws everybody, it's not surprising the other sectors would do it. The two that are the most important, I think, are the political distortions and the institutional distortions. And so political distortions, when the path to wealth goes through the state capital, goes through the presidential palace, then there's an enormous premium on having power, maintaining power, grabbing power. So the incentives to gain power, to hold power, are enormous. And there are reasons why there are structural reasons why this would be so. Resource wealth, often it has to pass through a very narrow funnel. So exports of oil or exports of other extractable resources, the rights to extract those are held by or controlled by the government or close allies of the government in most states. And Harry and Howard both mentioned Congo. I lived in Congo when it was Zaire and in the waning days of Mobutu, and it was the rewards from political power were just enormous. And I'm sure there are other places in the world where it's as stark as it was there, but I haven't seen those places. You guys have traveled more, so maybe you have. But the reward to being in power, the economic reward, is just enormous. And that creates a whole lot of incentives. People want to get power, people want to hold on to power. The data that I've seen about the stability of rulers in countries that are resource dependent would make you think they're the most peaceful, satisfied countries in the world because their rulers never turn over. They never get new leaders. And I think it's not because the elections are free and fair and people are just really happy with the way things are going, but because there's such a great incentive to hold on to power that it creates an incentive for lots of corrupt or somewhat corrupt activity that keeps people in power. And this has economic effects, and has effects at the ground level, to people for whom as I mentioned before, I'm most concerned. One is that it encourages politicians to pursue politically useful but inefficient projects. So when politicians are the economic managers, then they will use their economic levers to benefit themselves politically. And if you ask development economists and reporters, I imagine that you could come up with a list of your kind of paradigmatic, wasteful development projects. Mine is a steel factory in Nigeria. I think other people may have different examples. But one thing that unites them is that they were, at the time, in the view of the leader, politically useful, even if they ended up being enormously wasteful of the people's wealth, of the wealth that these leaders were entrusted with. Another problem when politicians are managers, it's not just that they try to hold on to power by any means, but that they make bad economic decisions, bad managerial decisions. Priorities can be set from the outside. So the most successful development projects, I think, are projects that are the result of kind of a process of dialogue between the funders from the outside, investors from the outside, and local people and local managers. So in the end, with some exceptions, but in the end, the project ends up being something in which there's been a lot of outside and local involvement. When wealth passes through this narrow funnel, as I described, then I think it very much interferes with and makes almost impossible that process. Another thing that resource wealth, development assistance, and Chinese investment does is it relieves political leaders of having to make the difficult economic decisions, things like levying taxes. They can get the money they need to stay in power and to satisfy their political constituencies without broad-based taxes, without making the kinds of tough choices that are politically unpopular. And we know in every country, the rate of payment of taxes is a difficult issue. One thing that I often think about is, I remember driving across Ghana, driving from Accra to Lomé in Togo, and seeing billboards along the highway of signs saying, this is why you should pay your taxes. It'd be a big photograph of a bridge or something like that, some infrastructure project, and say, this is what your taxes pays for. And the idea that politicians were selling the taxes as something that is in the national interest is rare. It's rare in every country, but it's very rare in countries where you don't have to do that to get the assets, the resources that you need to stay in power. So the political distortions are profound. They relieve politicians of making tough choices and being broad-based in the way that they think about their constituents. They allow priorities to be set more from the outside than from the process of interaction between outside and inside. And they allow the pursuit of politically rewarding but economically inefficient projects. The last set of distortions I want to talk about are institutional distortions. Think of the institutions as mechanisms to keep politicians from doing things that are much too bad for the country. There's nothing that's going to make politicians do exactly what I want them to do or what you want them to do, but something that sort of keeps politicians within a narrow band of behavior. The resource wealth and development assistance and assistance from China has the potential to distort these mechanisms. Howard's example of Angola and the IMF is a good one. When Angola, on the heels of reports that half of Angola's, the amount equivalent to half of Angola's annual budget had disappeared from the Treasury. So instead of $6 billion in the Treasury, they had $3 billion in the Treasury. On the heels of those reports, Angola is negotiating with the IMF. And I think that the Angola's poverty alleviation programs were a part of that discussion, but the anti-corruption guarantees were a significant part of that discussion. And Angola was able to get a line of credit from China that was equal to almost to thousands of dollars of what it was talking about with the IMF, and it was able to get by kind of, in some ways, it was almost like a derivative that we are here reading so much about today. So the government of Angola got a line of credit premised on continued support or oil supplies. The national oil company got also a line of credit equal to almost the same amount of money that from an investment bank in France, ironically, that was funded by at least some Chinese investors. So Angola ended up with more money and no constraints. And these mechanisms to hold politicians accountable are important, and it's hard to talk about these without being at least somewhat, maybe the nice way to say it is provocative, the not so nice way to say it is offensive, but when you talk about conditions to make leaders behave, and you're talking about a place with a history of enormous exploitation and colonialism and the slave trade, these are not comfortable things to talk about. But they exist in all societies, but they're absent, and I think for understandable reasons, in many places in Africa. So the mechanisms to hold politicians accountable are absent from the kinds of investments, the kinds of wealth transfers that I'm talking about, and they're explicitly absent from wealth transfers from China. I remember reading a quote from the minister in Sierra Leone talking about working with Chinese investors versus Western investors, and what he said was that Chinese investors don't require environmental impact statements or social impact statements, or more than one meeting. That you have one meeting, you make the deal, and then you get the check. And that idea that there are fewer constraints, there's a shorter path between deciding what you want to do and getting the money is perfectly rational. There's no, it's understandable why African leaders would go in that route. What I think is more troublesome is if you were a citizen of Sierra Leone, you would care a lot about whether there were mechanisms within the agreement that would keep your leaders from grabbing a lot of the money. And those mechanisms are absent from the deals that are typically absent from the deals that are made with China. So let me talk about a couple of ways in which this is a problem, and then some potential solutions. And I think the solutions part is the hardest part. I think that the trade and reforming trade, especially internally, I think that's one of the greatest insights of Harry's book, and that is important. But it's not I think, not likely to be the only way, the best way to get there. But I will say that I don't have, I should fess up to say I don't have a clearer or better way to get there, but I think that there are kind of structural or institutional things that need to happen. One is to think about what are the big problems. So what are the problems we're trying to fix? One is we want to have more mechanisms to keep leaders from grabbing more of the rents, as economists say, than they ought to get. This can be done through contracts, but a lot of the contracts that Chinese investors sign, Harry talked about the value added within countries, but there's also a complicated transfer pricing kind of issue where a lot of that value is captured by other firms that are controlled by the principal firm. So that even though it looks like China's doing something where they're leaving a lot of value, they're leaving a lot of, they're expatriating fewer of their resources, I'm not sure that that's true because of the transfer pricing structure of a lot of contracts. Another problem in contracts is that Harry talked about the labor part of it, that Chinese firms employ a lot of African labor. They do that but the dollars, I think, may be another way to think about that. And some of the contracts that China has in Angola for infrastructure development reserve 70% of the subcontracting funds for Chinese subcontractors. Now, if they turn around and hire day laborers who are local Angolans, that's a good thing. It's better than not, but it's also different than really using that capital to generate or improve capacity in Angola. One thing it's one of the best arguments for trade, I think, is that when excuse me, transfers of capital. There's also transfers of knowledge and transfers of innovation and ideas. China structures its deals so that that happens as little as possible. Not intentionally, but that's one of the results. So a couple of things to think about in terms of solutions before I see the orange card again. First is that there market participants have a greater incentive to seek information and act on that information than do citizens who are not well empowered. So when there are, and this is why I think the IFC's new plan to have sovereign wealth funds invest through the IFC is a good one. To the extent that there are market participants, people whose livelihoods depend on their making good investments, to the extent that they're involved, they look over the books much more closely than do people who have either little information or little incentive to look over those books. Some of the work that I've done at a very ground level has been with Maasai communities around the north edge of the Serengeti in the Masai Mara area in Kenya, and there's an enormous amount of wealth that goes into that part of Kenya, and there's a big land grab going on now because the law is going to change so that more private developers can come in, and there's going to be a lot of new development. But the Maasai communities get very, very little of that. And the law says you have the right to access the information, how much money is coming in to the developers who hold the contracts to run the hotels and the parks. But they can't get that information. The law tells them they can get that information, but they can't really get it. They have to, the process by which you get that information exposes you to all kinds of social and potentially in family problems. There are lots of reasons why people don't show up at the county commissioner's house and say, let me see your books, even if the law says that they can. But investors can do that. Investors are able to do that. And so to the extent that there is public-private partnership and that there are institutional players who get information and use that information, and then that information is much more available to the public, I think the electorate or citizenry will be more empowered. The other thing to think about, and this is, I think, it's harder to think about a way to implement it, but I'll mention it because I think it's important. The best run sort of, the sovereign wealth managers who do the best job are in Norway, Alaska, and Alberta. And one of the theories about why they do the best job is that their citizens view that wealth as theirs. They don't view that wealth as belonging to the state or something else. They view it as theirs. And so in Alaska, people get a check every year. This is your share of the oil money. And Norway and Alberta have similar, although not identical, processes. So people have a strong investment in knowing what's going on and seeing to it that that's not wasted. They want the biggest check they can possibly get every year. So they have an incentive to use that, to get information, to use the information, and to hold accountable people who waste their money. There are some NGOs and some scholars are kind of playing with ideas to try to create structures, legal structures, that would allow that phenomenon to be replicable in Africa. Things like, most revolve around providing more information to citizens. I'm skeptical of that, but I think the core idea that the feeling of ownership of the resource, as opposed to viewing it as owned by the state, is an important one. So I'll close with the answer, my answer to Howard's question, is this a good or a bad thing? I think it's likely to be, the Chinese investment is likely to end up being a bad thing, in part because China invests in a very pragmatic and rational way. When the investment doesn't make sense anymore, it's over. France had social and there were strong non-economic reasons, symbolic reasons why France wanted to be engaged in Africa. And those, I think, are not present with Chinese investment. And so, even though the legacy of France's involvement in Africa is a very mixed one, to say the least, I think China, when the need runs out, the money will run out. And Howard's forecast for 2050, I think, he presented that as unlikely but sad if it happens. I think it's, I hope it's unlikely, and I agree that it's sad, but I'm not sure. I'm not as sanguine about it, I think, as Howard is. I think that given the past, given with the lessons that I think we should draw from the past, that scenario is relatively likely. So I'll close on that pessimistic note. Happy your questions.
I just like to say,
Okay, I think, why don't we go ahead and open this up for discussion? We've got about 30 minutes to go, and I know you have issues that you'd like to bring up. Let me ask, though, when I recognize you, please introduce yourself to us and also identify whether you're addressing your question to one of the panelists or to the entire panel. So, why don't you start?
Anita Spring, University of Florida. My question is for, well, actually all of you, but particularly the first two speakers. How coordinated would you say China's policy is toward Africa from the government side compared to individual corporations and individual private entrepreneurs? That's sort of part A. And part B, on this whole idea of the proactivity of African leaders and the potential, everybody has spoken of that, and as an Africanist, I couldn't agree more. But I'm a skeptic, and I know you are as well. In terms of the potential for African leaders, I mean, we've seen in Mandela's, what he was able to accomplish in terms of Pan-Africanism in a short time. We've looked at the past for various people along the way, I'm not going to go through the names, and we look at the spaghetti bowl of, SADC, ECOWAS, they're all there, and they all overlap. And we've looked at ethnic chauvinism within and between countries. So I completely agree that it is really in Africa's court to be able to be proactive. We know the limitations of civil society in most countries and what's happening. So here we have, so how coordinated is China's policy versus what individuals and private companies are going to do, and how can we get any kind of coordination with the realities of that from the African perspective?
It's very, on the Chinese side, very quickly, I think it's very coordinated, and you can sort of break it down hierarchically. At the very top of the pyramid, I think you have the Ministry of Commerce, which seems to be the big driver of Chinese engagement with Africa. Then you have the Exim Bank, which tends to be the sort of the agent that serves as the intermediary in terms of deals and financing, and then you have at the next level provincial authorities with the government, central government having essentially told the provinces to go out and look for business, and having been more specific even in saying to certain provinces, we think you should be thinking about Africa. And so in order to please Beijing, for among other reasons, provinces then begin to compete in that realm. On the African side of this, I do a lot of these conferences, and I'm always struck and worried by the dearth of African participants in the conferences. Who is going to be the African interlocutor for China? A lot of people raise the example for me of Angola as being, Angola on the one hand being very much, as Patrick's comment suggested, like one of the most, I mean, if it's the equivalent of a narco state with the narcotics being employed, okay? And yet people cite Angola as being one of the countries that has a fairly competent and strategically savvy technocratic elite that has an increasingly clear vision of its own development future. I'm not sure I completely buy into that, but if Angola's the best example, I think we're in big trouble in terms of Africa, this proactivity thing we're talking about. I think that, I wonder, okay, so the Chinese, there was some, I think Harry said something about the Africans, in terms of this South-South trade, they're not really getting the best deal they could get out of the Chinese. Well, how do you get the best deal you could get out of somebody? You have to know them as well as they know you. And the Chinese are doing a much better job of getting to know Africa than Africans seem to be doing in getting to know China so far. And that has potentially very bad long-term implications. That if you're not sophisticated about the people you're dealing with, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to extract the maximum benefit out of the relationship. And I don't see African societies really investing intellectually in this engagement the way they need to. This relates to what Patrick said also about the entire thing's funneled through the head of state's office. And so, the head of state doesn't want a bunch of people who are expert in China or who are expert in, transparency or business negotiation. They want to control the money. And ultimately, they want to be able to benefit directly from the money.
Go ahead.
I'm not as sanguine as Patrick suggested. I'm sorry if I left that impression, but I think it's not too late for this relationship to salvage some considerable good. And I think we in this society have an interesting role to play in trying to enhance African civil society. I don't think it's unthinkable that China could come to have, even for self-interested reasons, a more enlightened or progressive engagement with African civil society. I had lunch a couple of years ago with Robert Rubin, who's now hiding in the Council of Foreign Relations because of the Citibank crash. But Robert Rubin said to me then, asked me then, he said, so, it looks like the Democrats have a really good chance to win the next election. I read your book. It got me thinking about Africa. I'd like to, if I could do one thing if I could impact the next Democratic administration, try to do one thing for Africa, what do you think that one thing could be? And before I could even begin to answer, he said, and I'm not saying there'd be a lot of money involved. And I said, well, okay, the one thing you could do and not have a lot of money involved. In my head, I'm sort of on the hot seat here and I have to think up something really quick. I had no idea what he wanted to ask me. I said, well, create a program, an educational exchange with Africa on a vast scale, where you get, and I pulled a number out of my head, 10,000 Africans a year get to come funded by the United States government, give tax incentives to American universities to host them, and create a new visa category that says when they finish their studies, they can't reside in the United States for 10 years. And that means you're doing what you can to lessen the brain drain. And let those people go back to Africa and energize their societies with these new competencies that they have obtained in the United States. That was my hot seat idea, but there are ways that we can work on to help. The key is, the Chinese have this government-to-government mentality. And I said, if they don't admit that the government is a real part of the problem, maybe the fundamental problem in Africa, then China will not impact African development in a globally positive way. So how do we enhance the non-governmental sector in Africa is the big question.
I wanted to comment on both of these. I would, in answering this first question about how coordinated China is, I think it's really important to distinguish between aid and what the corporates, in quotes, are doing. Aid, up to a certain point, is quite coordinated, as Howard was suggesting, between XM and the Ministry of Commerce. However, when you bring in the corporates, it's not terribly coordinated at all. In fact, there is a raging fight within Beijing between the Ministry of Commerce and XM and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There's a lot of schizophrenia now in Beijing about the reputational risks that China is dealing with its increasing involvement in Africa. There's also, I believe, which is generic in the system of governance in China, that no one can be in control of all of the information. And I think, from my years working in China, to believe that everything is coordinated as a finely tuned instrument, I think, is frankly naive. And from my work in Africa, watching the Chinese corporations work in China, it's sometimes rather a clumsy instrument. On the other hand, it's quite fascinating from the research that I've done to find, and this is consistent with what Howard's saying, is that there is a very deliberate strategy of segmenting competition among state-owned enterprises and public procurement contracts in the continent. This has a very pernicious competitive impact on the continent among Chinese competitors, so that if a construction firm is bidding on a contract, say, in southern Africa from Gansu province, SOE from Heilongjiang cannot bid on that contract, that they only can bid, up in the eastern horn of Africa. So I think I don't think it's quite as clear-cut at all that there's coordination on the Chinese level, but I think there is going on within the State Council and within the agencies an incredible set of tensions that is becoming more and more pronounced about what is China's role in Africa. And it's the rub between foreign policy and commercial policy. And in my view, I think this has not been researched well and I don't think understood very well. I think the other point about what's the potential for African leaders, I think this is precisely where I come out, that I think in order to negotiate well, the Africans do need to understand better what is the Chinese objectives. And I do think that the Africans increasingly are taking on, little by little, to be sure, advisors to help them understand. So before I left the bank, I was in a country in Eastern Africa where the Chinese were negotiating a particular very, very large deal, and the Africans were desperately in need of advisors to help negotiate on the other side of the table. So they are understanding that, exactly what is needed, and I dare say that there is a market now evolving rather quickly in Africa for the need for advisors to negotiate vis-a-vis the Chinese and vis-a-vis the Indians and so forth. And I think my point is that there is negotiations to be had, and it's not just Angola, it's not just DRC, it's in Uganda, it's in Rwanda, and I've seen more and more of these negotiations be quite successful. But my point is that they only can be successful, judged to be successful, if they represent the interests of civil society, and I think that to me is the real issue, the heart of the issue.
I would like to add just one or two things on those two questions. The question of the coordination of Chinese interests. And I think that the one answer to that question is that they're coordinated enough. They're coordinated in ways that matter to Chinese investors. So, for example, when firms are investing in Africa, one of the biggest, not the biggest, but an expense is how do they insure against non-commercial risks? So things, political risk insurance, that sort of thing. This is it's a cost that firms have to factor in. The Chinese firms, so long as they're investing broadly in the interest of the state, they don't have to insure themselves. They're insured by the state. So it doesn't cost them money to do that. That's a cost that they don't have to bear. And they're also, the Chinese government, as with other governments, acts as a chamber of commerce and kind of helps open doors. So the extent that it's coordinated, saying, you firm go here, you go here, you go here, I think that I agree with everything that's been said, but there are supports in place that allow firms to compete in a way that helps Chinese firms and doesn't really help. It allows for very little competition, little real competition in Africa. The second question you asked was about kind of Pan-Africanism, and I think that there's plenty of evidence, I think, that Pan-Africanism and the idea that there's going to be some sort of Pan-Africanist organization for political reasons or symbolic reasons, that hasn't worked. But in other parts of the world, the unifying force of economic incentives has allowed places, disparate countries, former enemies in Europe, to get together, and now they have one currency. So I think that the coming together for economic reasons is much more likely to be successful over the long term. The problem is, as we saw from the slide from Harry's book, that that these two things are swirled together in a way. It's hard to see how to kind of untangle them. But I think any of the political arguments for Africa should get together because it's Africa, those are doomed to failure. But the economic ones, the kinds that Harry described, I think are much more likely to be successful.
Okay, good. You had a question? No? I'm sorry. Did you have a question?
Well, I would, Grafton Trumbull University, we keep coming back to this issue of civil society, and continuing on the pessimistic note. Can you give any examples now of successful constraints imposed by civil society on the process of negotiation, on choices made, on the funding problem? And if you can't, can you foresee some positive development in this direction that will affect what you've been talking about?
I would say that in Zambia, the civil society reaction to the early on sort of rush of Chinese investment has forced a public conversation about the presence and role of China in the Zambian economic sphere, and that is useful and is potentially important. I think that it's too early to say what the result of this is going to be, but the fact of a conversation, I think, is the beginning of meaning in this context. I would look to other parts of the world where civil society has come to play an important role in reining in governments that are sort of all-encompassing and wildly abusive of their powers. I worked for several years in Central America and watched the wind down of the Cold War in Central America and the emergence of civil societies that stopped predatory, literally in the sense of murderous governments, and predatory in a financial sense. And that was the result of the gradual strengthening of the role of the citizen, the idea of citizenry, and the development of rights of association and enlargement of the public sphere, so I know the power of these sorts of things. The problem is that these are all tremendous weak spots in China itself. China doesn't recognize the right of association, of free association. China does not have a tradition of pluralism. China very much believes in the government as the ultra sovereign force in the life of the nation. It doesn't recognize the right of its own citizens to raise objections to things, certainly not in any ready sense. So where this is going with China then becomes, I think, more problematic.
I think that there are a couple of examples, and what unifies them in my mind, except for the Zambia example, which I think is an interesting one. One, the reaction in Sierra Leone to the deal that Mittal Steel, Archimald Mittal, signed there, and the reaction also to in South Sudan to Talisman. What those had, I think what made those effective examples, or effective responses by local people to kind of outside investment, were also interest from outside NGOs, activist groups. I'm a law professor, so human rights lawyers, and I think that that process where local people and outsiders with similar interests work together, there was an effective, a relatively effective pushback. There's a similar, I thought there would be a similar thing going on in Congo, where there's a review of the mining contracts and all the different contracts. I'm not sure that that's going to work all that well. I remember when when Joseph Kabila first came to power, I got a call from the executive vice chairman at Hill & Knowlton saying, we've been asked by several American firms to enhance their presence in Congo. So we want to do this within the next week or two. How do we do it? Because they were, as Howard said before, they knew a lot more about Congo than Congo was going to know about the firms that they were dealing with. But also, they knew that there was, if they're dealing just with local people, it's a much sweeter deal for their clients. It turns out they all got burned in the end because the government changed a couple more times, or at least those who held the authority over the mines changed a couple more times. But that idea that we will act quickly before other people can get involved, I think, is an important one. And the involvement of lots of different stakeholders, including some outsiders, that has unified the successful examples, I think.
Okay. So I have a couple of comments and then a question. I'll be quick. I think one of the most difficult things about this field is, first of all, things are changing so fast on the ground. I mean, China's changing fast and things in Africa are changing fast. And there's a lot of new research that's coming out that is published a lot more slowly than people would like. So I think there are a lot of really interesting new things coming out that people aren't aware of. So one is, I think, this idea of coordination now. I mean, new work coming out of people at SOAS is showing that China's activities in Africa are becoming increasingly diverse, fragmented, and much more difficult to control. And one example of that is the shipment of arms into Durban that was supposedly going to Mugabe in Zimbabwe, and the Chinese government actually really wasn't even aware that one of their own companies was involved in these arms deals. It was quite an embarrassment to the Chinese government. The second is there is actually a great interest in China, I believe, in both symbolism and cultural. Cultural exchange is going at a rapid pace. It's increasing. Symbolic projects are coming back. The expo in Shanghai all of Shanghai is being raised to prepare for the expo. There will be huge Africa tents and Africa singing and song and all these kinds of things. So I think that is something that's developing as well. But I want to go back to this bigger question about the issue, what's good for Africa. And I think, not to sort of throw out a big philosophical question, but I think we have to think about what we mean by good and who's defining that, and especially thinking about development itself. And I guess for Harry, we associate the export of raw materials all the way back to the slave trade with exploitation. So the image of Africa exporting processed goods sounds liberating, it sounds empowering. But in fact, isn't it true that under AGOA, some of those South Asian entrepreneurs were really just kind of moving sweatshops from other places, or Mauritians, to Africa, where they could have African labor bringing in raw materials and exporting with preferential trade agreements? I'm not sure, that's something I've heard. But I guess the larger question is, again, what always comes up is, how does development move Africans from being workers to being owners? How does a middle class develop? So is this kind of model, which sounds liberating because it's not raw materials, how does this really develop a sustainable and long-lasting kind of ownership for African people?
Well, this is a very large question, and I won't get into it other than to say that this has very little to do with China. I think this has to do with the larger question of Africa's international integration, of which China, India, and Middle East, Russia's investment is just the most recent incarnation of it. And that Africa, if it wants to develop, which I'll mention in just a second what I mean by that, has got to go through this transition at some point in time. Okay? What does development mean? Climbing the value chain is one part of it. Becoming an owner is one part of it. Being able to be mobile, to have a freedom to choose of where to live and how to work. Being able to have health care, social safety. I mean, this is a multifaceted thing, but surely you would want to have more value created in your factory at your home than being able to not have value created. So it's a very long, complicated question, but I think the point stands, which we talked about at dinner last night, and from where I sit, I think it's very, very important to have this prism that Africa is beginning to develop. This is what I mean by this second opportunity. Who are we to say, to be very, very brutish about it, who are we to say that, finally someone is taking an interest in Africa? You know, it happens to be R&D coming from China, right? Or, you know, Indians. It's finally Africa is becoming integrated to some extent into the world economy. Africans are engaging in joint ventures with Chinese and Indian firms. It's pretty hard to argue that that's a bad thing. On the margin, they're building infrastructure. You know, there's a huge infrastructure gap in Africa. Should the World Bank and the IMF or the African Development Bank have a monopoly? They can't, and they should not. The gap is huge. So, you know, it's a huge question. Obviously, and I know that you know that. I'm sure you have a.
Yeah, I'd like to come at it a little bit from a slightly different direction. I don't really disagree terribly with anything you've said. Before I do so, though, I want to come back to something that Patrick said a few minutes ago. I do think that it's true that if the resources are gone in Congo or in Nigeria or wherever, Angola, wherever it is, China will find its way to the exit door. And that's why I painted the scenario of 2050 when the populations have doubled. And it's a pretty good timeline for, you know, projection of bauxite or copper or whatever the resource is of the end of the known reserves at present exploitation rates for many of these situations. But I don't go quite so far as Patrick went to say that this is all that matters, that you can't compare China and France, that France had a sentimental attachment and linguistic attachment and all these things that China does not have. I think China has a very real political and cultural attachment to Africa, that making the case of we being brothers in a South-South sense to China is more than superficial rhetoric. It means something important in China's own self-identity and in China's global face. And I think it's wrong to underestimate that. And that's the culture part of your answer, your question. On the sweatshops and all of this, you know, I don't think that's really the problem. I mean, I don't want anybody to have to work in a sweatshop, but the fact is that a country like Vietnam is rising very rapidly up the sort of economic tables, having gotten a significant part of its takeoff from that very kind of labor. And, you know, you have to start at some level. And, you know, the French ran Ivory Coast for a very long time, and they never made sweatshops. What they made was big plantation companies that exported unprocessed cocoa and coffee. And there was very little value added locally, and that worked as far as it worked, but it didn't work beyond that point. And the next point is making, you know, industry of some kind in an African context. So I think it's wrong to sort of besmirch that. I mean, it's right to think of the social consequences and the worst abuses of that kind of labor, but it's wrong to write off the value of that kind of labor altogether. I think that's an important part of achieving economic momentum for any developing country. There's a couple of things that we haven't talked about here, and I don't want to take too much time, but so I'll only mention one of them. But you know, I just read a really interesting working paper that Harry and I were talking about before the session began, about what should Africa learn from the Chinese experience. And this working paper makes, at great length, and I think very convincingly the case, that what really caused China's economic takeoff was agriculture. And agriculture hasn't even come up in this discussion. We've talked about trade, we've talked about minerals, we've talked about industrial investment, we've talked about, you know, presidential palaces, we've talked about civil society. We haven't, this, I think, the first time the word agriculture has been mentioned.
I did say food processing.
Not the word. You know, and I think we're missing, to that extent, we're missing a really big piece of the picture. And, you know, Africa, how do you get African entrepreneurs? You get African entrepreneurs by having, by people having savings, by people having excess. And the best way to have excess, and I'm really out of my depth, I'm not an economist, but you know.
Just as well.
You know, most Africans are still peasants, okay? And if you can make them more productive enough so that they can save some money and think about doing other things, and then I think that is a really important spark to the African economy. And you know, there's people are beginning to brood about the notion of China becoming deeply involved in African agriculture, I think this is one of the most interesting things to watch. What's the importance of the demonstration effect as Chinese come in and they begin, Chinese know a bit about agriculture. If they can come in and make agriculture work in certain African contexts, even if they're doing so in the most self-interested way, I think the demonstration effect has an interesting potential there. And I'll stop there. Yes.
I know there's a lot of people that have questions. We have time for one more.
Okay, two short questions. First of all, on the economic presentation, Harry, you observed at one point that over 90% of the FDI and trade still involves the US and EU, and yet here in the Q&A you said, hopefully, finally, someone's helping bring Africa into the world, someone's helping globalize Africa. Why is the little bit of rapidly growing Chinese investment and aid going to do what the 90% hasn't done to this point? So that's one question I'd like to ask about. The second one, let me be very polemical, an advocate for the pessimist, let's say, and suggest that I work on China and Central Asia, by the way, that China has a global model of diplomacy and a global model of how to export business investment. And the global model of diplomacy is build alliances with countries that care about sovereignty above all else, that want to protect the state from any form of foreign interference, and in particular want to maximize the ambit of the rulers, very much in the way that Patrick was talking about before. Okay? Bully for them in Africa. Perfect setup, right? The model of exporting business investment is find countries with resources or find countries with cheap labor, engage in labor repression, ignore environmental concerns, and so forth. Since you're far down the product cycle, you want to have razor-thin margins. You want to maximize a little bit of profit you could squeeze out locally, which means, again, oppose any civil society efforts to bargain for a better deal. So why should this pessimist be hopeful that Chinese investment in Africa is going to help in these ways?
Who are you asking?
Actually, that's a question to all of you.
I've talked a whole lot. I mean, I'll just say in a couple of sentences. Okay?
Thank you.
I think China is facing a really big learning curve and steep learning curve in Africa. And I think one of the areas China is going to bloody its nose over and over again. And eventually maybe we'll learn the lesson, maybe we won't, and with bad consequences for China and obviously for Africa too, is that African civil society is actually quite advanced in many places. And that Africans are not, the leaders may be completely null, but African civil societies are not. And so you think you're going to come in with this, we're your brothers, we're all South-South, it's win-win, all of this empty talk, and sign a deal with the State House, and the State House then sends the check to a Swiss bank account, and the resource then becomes depleted, and the Africans themselves are going to stay quiet about that? I don't believe that. I don't believe that for a minute. Now, I'm not saying that, I don't know how that battle is going to play out, but there's going to be a battle. And in some places, the battle is going to change the equation, I think, in important ways. And so that's my small place of hope right there.
No, I completely agree. And having been the point man for the bank during the Russia crisis, where I would argue, having been in charge of $3.8 billion on the table, where $3.8 billion really meant something, and withholding a large part of it and bringing it back because the Russians didn't do reform, and then watching the crisis really actually having finally some kind of effect on Russia, albeit somewhat ephemeral, I think, to this day. I'm a big believer in tough love, and I think ultimately there is going to be a bloody nose, and I think it's really important. And this is all part of my belief of the whole transition process that Africa has got to go through. It's going to be messy. There's going to be a huge transition cost, but it has to happen. I think our job, generally in the West, the multilateral job, is to provide some kind of social safety net. So this is my view on that question. On the first question, somewhat connected to the first point is that I think because it's South-South commerce, I think there is a qualitative difference between the kinds of, the potential is there for Chinese and Indian, Middle Eastern investment to provide a way out. But this is an if-then statement. It's a conditional statement. It's by no means a guarantee. And I think it's qualitatively different from the traditional North-South investment historically has been. Having said that, it's very clear to me from my current job now, and from what I've been observing in the last 2 years, even in my previous job, that the Chinese and Indian investment, as small as it is in levels, the growth of it has really jettisoned US and European, the traditional investors, to begin to take a second look at Africa. You know, there's nothing like competition spurring on competition. And I can tell you that the number of huge Fortune 50 companies in the United States, their European equivalents, who talk to me about where am I going next in this world, 9.9 out of 10, the first words out of their mouth are Africa. 3 years ago, they never would have said Africa. Now, there are many reasons for that, some of which have to do with what the Chinese and the Indians are doing in Africa. Some of it has to do with what's going on in our own economies. But clearly, there are first mover advantages, albeit small, that the Chinese and the Indians and others are reaping in Africa that are making some of the traditional investors nervous. I think that's great for Africa. I think that's great. But the question is, what do my clients are the African citizenry? You know, what do they need to do to position themselves to take advantage of that in the best way possible? It's going to be a really long haul.
Do you have a couple of brief comments, Patrick? Okay. I think we're off to a great start. Very thought-provoking discussion. I know there's still a lot of you that have things that you'd like to bring up, but hopefully we'll continue discussing these issues in the next day and a half. I'm going to turn this back over to Heidi.
I'm just going to piggyback on Barb's comment that there's still 2 more panels this afternoon and a morning session on Saturday. We certainly hope to see you all this afternoon to continue some of these conversations. Just one small point, agriculture will be discussed. So hold on to that thought. And just let me thank our panelists. So one more round of applause. Thank you very much.